Great, perfect. Apologies, guys, for the delay. There's a bit of a technical snafu, but thanks you for your patience. As you see, people are piling into the webinar. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. I'm Harris Schwabe, founder and CEO of Newton's Tree, and joining me today for the inaugural episode. Thanks so much, Hugh. Is Dr. Hugh Harvey from Hardian Health. Um, so I'm just going to set the frame and scene for the type of conversation we're going to have. Hugh and I have done no prep, but Hugh's a professional, so he doesn't need any prep. The the Hugh and I both have been working in sort of the medical device and AI space for a long time, and I think he'll share the perspective that there's a lot of challenges in the health system when it comes to adopting these technologies, and a lot of the answers are not written in a textbook, and a lot of the expertise is bottled in people like Hugh's head, right? And through their lived experience and the scars that they've borne in trying to do their bit in facilitating adoption. And so this conversation series is an opportunity to basically unveil some of the lessons you've learned, some of the challenges you've faced, and give people access to that insight. So I hope it's going to be useful. Um, First of all, Hugh, I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, but I'm going to dive into a bit more of your work and your career. But do you want to tell the folks who you are if they don't already know?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Harris. And happy to unpick my old scars, as you say, in this space. For those who don't know me, I'm a radiologist by background. I got to consultant level before leaving the NHS. I spent some time in academia studying some very early machine learning modeling techniques based on computer vision. And then I had some interesting experiences in industry. I worked at Babylon Health for a year, which we can certainly touch on in this call. I was the clinical director at Kheiron Medical, which is a UK startup looking at breast cancer screening. I've been a chair of the Topol Review, which was looking at AI in healthcare, the lead to the future. I've advised the MHRA, and I speak internationally on AI and medical devices. And my current role is managing director of a business I set up 6 years ago when I had the silly notion that software as a medical device was going to become a big thing at some point in the future. So I feel slightly vindicated that I was correct 6 years ago. And now I run a consultancy which offers services to global clients. And I've probably got more devices CE marked and FDA approved than anyone else I know. I'm not claiming everyone in the world. They may be, I don't know.
I want to see a league table for that. No, I think the thing that I've always really appreciated in all the perspectives that you've shared publicly, because one of the other things you've missed out is your public persona, which is important. And we'll get onto the topic of system leadership and what that means and how you've been a system leader over the years, is the fact that you've worn many different hats in this space and gotten those perspectives. You were a researcher at the ICR, I think, doing MR and image analysis work. And like you mentioned, you've been involved in policy work with the Topple Review. Um, but as a training doctor, when you were doing your specialty training as a registrar, were you already thinking about some of these things, or was there a moment where it sort of flipped a switch for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as a radiology registrar, I
Where did
was
you train, by the way?
I trained down in Brighton, was my
Yeah.
main deanery, which was great. I do recommend Brighton to anyone who wants to visit. So yeah, I was fully committed as a radiology registrar. I did the 5 years full run through training, passed all the exams that you have to do, and I loved it. But I was always in radiology because I was always interested in computers. I was a geek when I was a kid. I would code websites from scratch in HTML and CSS. And even as a registrar, I set up a tiny little business creating 3D printable models based on data from CT scans. I mean, I have these on my shelf up here. You can't see them all, but look, here's someone's hip that I 3D printed like 10 years ago. So I have a little business, and so I got a little bit of an entrepreneurial streak through doing that and selling services to hospitals. But it really wasn't until I went to the Institute of Cancer Research to do a research degree that I got into the machine learning side of things. And I remember when you apply to go and do a research degree, they ask you what area is your thesis going to be in, and you've got a broad choice. Obviously, it's going to be something radiology linked. But literally, just a couple of days before I was writing down my application, I'd read a paper. I forget the name of the author, but it was the seminal paper on what were called UNets, which are U-shaped neural networks, which could do segmentation. So the typical thing everyone knows of, is it a cat? No, can you draw an outline of a cat or a dog on this photo? And that was based on work by Fifi Lei and ImageNet. And I thought, well, obviously, if we can segment dogs and cats, why can't we start segmenting stuff on scans? It's the same principle, surely. So I worked on that for 2 years.
What year would this have been?
This would have been 2016, I think.
Okay, yes. The early days.
The early days, exactly. So I finished that in 2016, I should say. It was 2014 to 16. And so I sort of caught that AI bug. And I'm a really bad coder, but I can open a Python notebook and copy someone's machine learning code and get it to run. Um, and then I thought, well, I want to go do something in the AI space in medicine. This is hugely exciting. I could see all of these applications across radiology. But there was no one doing anything commercially in AI and radiology at that time in the UK. I did apply to Google, didn't get in, but I applied to Babylon.
Or as like a clinical specialist role?
Yeah, they were hiring the odd SHO here and there.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I thought, why not? But didn't get in.
yeah.
But I did get into Babylon. And you might think, why would a radiologist join Babylon? They weren't doing radiology. But it's because I had a clinical background and some machine learning knowledge. And so I got into industry. And Babylon was a really interesting experience. I mean, we all know the story that it's pretty much entirely collapsed since then. That wasn't based on anything that I did, I don't think so. But I became involved in the regulation around medical devices. So I had never heard of the concept of a medical device.
In your training or your research?
No, I think doctors just don't ever get taught that
Yeah,
the things they're using in hospitals are medical devices, and that there's a set of rules and laws that apply to how they are produced and validated.
yeah.
And it was only one day when I was at Babylon, the MHRA knocked on the door and said, "Can we speak to your regulatory affairs team? We think you're building a medical device," because we were building an AI chatbot. And I got introduced to the MHRA as the head of regulatory affairs, which was not my title at the time, but it quickly became my title. And so I worked with the MHRA for 6 months to make sure that we were compliant with the rules and regulations as they were at the time. And we got a class 1 self-certification to do triage via this chatbot. You can't do a class 1 for triage now. It's class 2. Things have been upgraded. So that was kind of like a world first in a way. I learned, I built a quality management system from scratch. I did a clinical technical documentation. We had all our clinical evidence drawn up. I'm not saying it was a perfect regulatory set of documentation, but it was a baptism of fire. And those 6 months were stressful, with the leadership at Babylon every day asking me if we had FDA approval yet, and we never got there.
And this would have been what, around 2018, 19?
I think it was 2017 to 2018.
2017. And then I'm curious, how do you go from someone who doesn't know what the word CE stands for to be in front of the MHRA trying to come up with a regulatory strategy for a pretty ambitious startup? Is it all self-taught? Were there peers? Yeah.
It was self-taught. We did hire some external consultants at the time as well, and a lot of reading on my behalf. Like,
yeah,
I literally just read all the rules and regulations. Now, I'm fairly lucky in that I come from a family of lawyers, so reading laws and stuff and discussing laws and the subjectivity of interpreting them is something that we used to do around the family table. So I don't know. It became my home, and I fell deeply in love and passionate with that area. I could see flaws in it. The regulations weren't perfect, and undoubtedly they still aren't perfect. But at least I could see that there was actually a sensible framework for ensuring that at least manufacturers were doing the bare minimum to make sure the devices were safe and effective, and cybersecure. So the cybersecurity laws only just come into place, GDPR and stuff like that, and they just come into place. So it was a really, really interesting time. Obviously, I didn't stay at Babylon forever. I grew kind of frustrated with the the dichotomy between what we had regulatory clearance for, which was triage, and the claims being made by the company publicly that it could diagnose, I don't know what the claim was, 80% of conditions, which wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily true.
How small was the company when you went in, and how big was it when you left?
So it had just moved to its big London office in South Ken. I think it was about 30 or 40 people max. By the time when I interviewed it was about 16 people in a small office in Chelsea. When I actually started, it was about 30 or 40 people. They were what they call blitz scaling, and it quickly grew to over 300 people in the year I was there.
Yeah.
It was almost like impossible to know what was going on. There was a lot of staff turnover and churn and changes in direction in product strategy. So it was a messy, complicated, stressful environment to be in, but I learned a lot.
And then the obviously your background clinically is radiology, right? And you've had stints at least advising or working with people like Kheiron and other radiology applications. And we will broaden out to sort of the medtech AI space in general. But the elephant in the room these days, in sort of 23, 24, is what's happening with radiology AI, right? People in this space will be familiar with sort of the high level stats in that, something like 70, 80% of market approved applications are in radiology. It was sort of the market leader. You were working on this sort of stuff in 2014, 15. I started my PhD around the same time doing the same sort of stuff. Um, but we've not seen the returns that we expected to. I work so my clinical background is medical physicist working at Guy's St Thomas's. I work really closely with radiology. It still looks largely the same as it did sort of 10 years ago. Um, can you share a bit of your perspective around how you've been or how you had historically helped some of the imaging AI companies and why you think we've not made it quite over the hill and if it's still even possible?
Really, really good question. So I'll start with how I've been helping. I mean, so while I was at Babylon, I was in talks with a couple of the founders who came through Entrepreneur First, and they were founding Kheiron, which was going to focus on radiology AI. And I remember having discussions with them. Originally, they wanted to do liver segmentation, and I said, no, we should choose a really simple binary problem, uh, which is breast cancer, because
Yep.
the only reason you take a mammogram is to look for cancer. It's a yes or no problem. It essentially, obviously, it's more nuanced than that. We know, but to me, it just seemed like the simplest thing. Plus, it had a large public data set. I believe in Surrey,
Yeah.
really, really good data set of mammograms called Optimam, which Google at the same time were trying to get access to and build a product. So I joined them, became clinical director, and we were a small startup, and we basically were competing with Google at the time. They published well before us, but we managed to get the first regulatory clearance in Europe uh, for a deep learning based radiology AI solution. So it felt really, really groundbreaking at the time. So I'd done the world's first AI chatbot, and then I did the world's first, or Europe's first deep learning radiology device. It wasn't just me at Kheiron. There was a team and there was a special quality manager as well. It was a team effort, I should add. Um, and then we fast forward. So that was in 2018. Fast forward now to 2024, and as you say, quite rightly, radiology at the coalface hasn't significantly changed. Why is that? And I think it's three things. I think it's one, all of the regulatory approved tools are kind of what I call single use only. So they can
Mm.
only do one thing, and they can do it extremely well. They're kind of like, I liken them in my head to like idiot savants. There are certain people with learning disabilities through no fault of their own are exceptionally good at one thing. Like they can listen to a song and play the entire concerto back to you on the piano, but they don't know how to make a cup of tea or cross the road safely.
Yeah.
It's kind of like these single-use AI tools are a bit like that. They can do one thing. If you give them a mammogram, they're really, really good at finding a cancer, but you can't do anything else with them whatsoever. So they're really, really quite singular in their purpose. They also are incredibly brittle. They really rely on the breadth of the training data that you give them. And there's this theory that's still ongoing in AI in circles across all industries that if you just give AI more data, it will just get better. And that's true to an extent. Then the third part of the problem is really the ground truth that you're giving these AIs is only as good as the consultant radiologist because they are doing the vast majority of the labeling. And so the reality is that you have a very singular, brittle model that is only really as good, if not slightly better, standalone compared to a radiologist. And that's not enough to solve the radiologist's workflow problems as they currently arise, because radiologists, when they look at a scan, maybe apart from a mammogram, they're looking for thousands of different things. They're taking in other context, the patient history, the referral note, previous imaging, and they're making reasoned human judgments on the entirety of the scan, not one single finding at a time. So I think the reason we haven't really seen radiology AI deployed at scale is because it's not particularly useful to consultant level radiologists. And this has been backed up recently. I just came back from Italy from the European Society of Medical Imaging Informatics. It was presentation after presentation of all these radiologists who've been trying AI, and they'd all shown really that it wasn't improving the specialist radiologists' performance or indeed their turnaround times. It's pretty good at helping non-radiologists, so helping people in the emergency room get a quick X-ray report so they can make a decision, or for stroke, making a decision before a radiologist can even open the scan. But actually, when you compare the performance to radiologists, it might be slightly better standalone, but you're not allowed to use it standalone. You have to have a human in the loop. And therefore, and then ultimately, it's not really adding significant amounts of value.
And so, is it that we just got the use case or some of the use cases wrong at the beginning? Instead of trying to improve consultant level practice, maybe we should have been focusing on, yes, maybe ED workflows or increasingly reporting radiographer workflows. So is it just a case of taking your point around the brittleness and the single purpose or single use? Could it be diverted to a slightly different setting or different user, still in radiology, but where it actually does provide an ROI or an improvement?
Yes, there are some use cases where that is true. So assisting radiographers in reporting chest X-rays or assisting emergency physicians in stroke and CT and things. But ultimately, the law still stands that a qualified radiologist has to sign off on a report. That's the legally binding clinical document that is the output of a radiology department. And so, yes, you can help with turnaround times in critical situations or for things where like a normal abnormal classification might be useful in the emergent clinical setting. But you still need to have that human in the loop by law to actually do the clinical evaluation in total and provide a report. And there are separate guidelines, separate to the medical device regulations, called the ionizing radiation regulations.
Yep.
And they've just been updated, and they've just actually clarified, yep, software cannot be what's known as the operator. Software cannot be the final reporter. It has to be a human. And so really, we need to think kind of almost at a systemic level and a political level. When do we think AI is actually going to be ready to take on that final role of signing things off? And I don't think we're there yet as a society, let alone practically in terms of what AI can actually do.
Yeah, well, that's perfect because it leads on to my next question, which is around, yeah, population level risk, right? And what do we want to do as a society in terms of dealing with our risk and delivering a sustainable healthcare service? And then pressure or opportunity to change regulations, right? So we've seen the MHRA put out this call for projects inviting people to essentially suggest use cases that are currently hindered by existing regulation to see if there's an opportunity to enable them. And one of the use cases I hear a lot about from clinical departments is the opportunity of potentially fully automating at least some portion of clinical reporting. For example, normal chest X-rays, right, or normal MSK X-rays as well. Is that whose job is it to push for that? And do you think we've done the right kind of engagement to even start talking about this kind of discussion?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a really fascinating area. We're working on a project on that at the moment. Just even looking at the health economics of it, like regardless of whether we can do it or should do it, would it even give a
work.
return on investment to
Yeah,
do that? is what we're looking at. And we're doing that as an independent kind of exercise, so not related to one particular manufacturer. But yeah, if you could reduce the amount of normal scans that get done, which is an incredible amount of normal chest X-rays, by the way,
Get done or get reported?
so, well, this is the thing. In some hospitals, they don't get reported,
Yeah.
which is technically, missing out on the whole point of healthcare. Like if you do
Yeah,
it,
well, this is the population risk bit. Yeah.
yeah, and there will be cancer sitting in that pile of unreported chest X-rays for sure, and other pathologies. If you can remove normals, like confidently normals, doesn't have to be every single normal, but if you can remove 10% of the chest X-rays that the NHS does and have it fully automated by an AI, my guess is there should be some economic incentive to build something that does that. But as we've said, the question is, are we politically and systematically ready for that system? So where would the push have to come from? It would have to come from the end users, which is the patients and the clinicians who say, look, this technology is needed. You'd have to have buy-in from the professional governing bodies like the Royal College of Radiologists, who are understandably protective of their professions and their skills. And it would have to be enabled by a change in regulation and law. So I've become so deeply involved in regulation now that a lot of my work is trying to advise on how we could possibly change regulation. And that is, it's very complex to change regulation because everything is moving so quickly. So whatever changes you make, you're never going to please everybody because they're going to say, well, why didn't you go far? You didn't go far enough. But you have to take steps. The other thing is that regulation covers populations, millions and millions of people. And so you
Yeah.
really have to do them very, very carefully. Because if you make a mistake and over-regulate or under-regulate, you can harm people. So if you under-regulate, you can harm people by allowing dangerous things on market, and then you only realize the harms later. If you over-regulate, then you may miss out on actually getting technology that actually works and is economically viable into the hands of the people who need it. And so there's always a balance. And I kind of view the regulatory structure almost like a kind of pressure gauge, and it swings between being too high pressure to too low pressure. And I think that the consensus at the moment in the sector is that it's slightly too high pressure. But you've got to bear in mind that there are companies, largely American companies, claiming that this stuff is going to change the world. Now, that is a great claim. That's
Yeah.
huge. And with that claim must come the burden of proof, evidence, and responsibility. And so therefore, I think the regulators have kind of gone, all right, you're going to claim it's changing the world? Prove it. And these are the things we want you to prove. And so it's almost like a reaction to the hype that's happened. If people had come in and said, AI might work, we need to evidence it, blah, 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 then the regulations might actually be a bit leaner because the regulators wouldn't be so worried about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to get on the topic of VC funding and whether that's a force for good or bad when it comes to building or in regulated markets, particularly like healthcare. I just wanted to throw in a curveball when it comes to the automation argument, and it's something that I think a lot from a risk management perspective. And you'll be aware of this as well from the companies that you work with or others that you advise, in that with the increasing amount of AI that we have seen in the UK, especially, or just generally in the globe. So the AI is being deployed, it is being used to a degree. We've also started to see some incidents prop up. And I, just from my very sort of unscientific experience, um, a lot of it is around automation bias, right? Where software is not perfect, understandably. It gives a wrong diagnosis or a slightly wrong diagnosis, and the clinician or the human in the loop isn't fully paying attention, and they essentially either commit that mistake to the medical record, or it then influences a downstream clinical action. And I wondered what you thought about whether automation potentially takes away that risk. And the analogy that I sometimes think about is self-driving cars, right? And a set aside sort of the per mile risk of accidents with self-driving cars, whenever there is an accident, it's almost often because the human hasn't done their bit of the job. in that they're not paying attention, they've taken their hands off the wheel, and a big sort of voice in the self-driving scene is we shouldn't be allowing this technology until it's capable of full autonomy, right? Which is, look, hey, if we're going to have self-driving cars, let's set the bar over here, and let's not do it until it reaches that. Is that what we should be doing with medical AI? Is
Yeah,
saying, hey, look, let's not beat around the bush. Let's just go for full automation, and let's not do anything until we get there.
I totally understand that argument. But the reality is that, as you say, none of these devices are perfect. And humans just instinctively have that desire and that belief that if we are in control, it makes liability and the fact that humans do make mistakes, but we have some kind of inbuilt feedback mechanism within our processes and systems to either punish or deter or improve, depending on the outcomes. Whereas AI doesn't necessarily have that speed of feedback. I know everyone thinks AI can, learn from every case, but it doesn't. That's not how AI training works. It works in massive batches with slow releases. I see the argument that, yeah, maybe we should just go for full automation. But the counter argument to that really is you have to kind of prove that we're ready for full
Of
automation.
course, yeah, yeah,
So I would suggest there's two steps to take before that. The first is to use these things as they're currently intended with a human in the loop. And then to do that real world research once we're confident enough in the stability of these systems, they're not drifting, they're not creating too many errors. Once we're confident enough to slowly start doing cautious research around automating aspects of it. And it's going to take time. And I know that, investors, and you mentioned VC funders, they want it to happen now. But this is healthcare. And no one is going to forgive anybody if patients come to harm because we've rushed into something. Now, you could say, well, actually, the harm of not using it is greater. And people like to say that all the time.
yeah,
Like, my only counter argument to that is, okay, well, let's measure the risk versus the benefit. Go and actually do that study.
yeah,
Because you can't just say, oh, it's obvious the harm is greater by not using it. That's not a scientific argument. Prove it. With great claims comes great responsibility, and you must prove it. And you can only
yeah,
prove that by doing the research. And
yeah.
research
No,
takes time.
I completely agree. It reminds me as well this idea of when should we start? What is sufficient evidence? When should we start doing AI, and where should we be doing it? It reminds me of a comparison that someone told me. I was at a meeting last year at Boston, and they were talking about genetic engineering in sort of the mid 20th century, and how one of the early use cases, one of the companies, Monsanto, is one of the big players, obviously in this space, um, had decided to experiment with milk producing cows and to improve their yield. And it wasn't a use case that anybody wanted or asked for. There wasn't a shortage of milk. And what then ended up happening was that there was a lot of wasted milk, a lot of cows being slaughtered. And it then sort of tainted this idea of genetic engineering, right? And we've seen this happen sort of closer to our field with the early work around in London around acute kidney injury and machine learning with patient data, how that wasn't even really a machine learning product, right? That we were giving access to a large multinational company to patient data, and uh, ultimately, it wasn't even to build something that we had asked for. And and this is at risk of hammering the point is whether we should be waiting and saying, hey, let's wait until the ROI is really obvious and people actually need it and it's clear that they need it, and then we start doing AI.
Yeah, it's the Jeff Goldblum quote from Jurassic Park, isn't it? So
Yes.
preoccupied with whether you could, you didn't think about whether you should. I'm all for people doing research in this space. I'm absolutely up for that. I think that level of innovation is absolutely perfect. What people get wrong is that every single piece of research should be commercialized in some way. That's not the point of science. Science is driven by a hypothesis, and your null hypothesis should always be this doesn't work and it's not going to be useful, but I'm going to research to see if it could be. And if it's not useful, you stop doing it and you go, well, there we go. And you publish your results and say it wasn't useful. But we live in this era of hype, where everybody with an idea is just kind of assuming that the AI is going to be blindingly obviously useful and performant and safe. And that's just not true.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say about are we ready for automation, going back to that point, is that when you put these AI systems in, the amount of monitoring and maintenance they need is actually incredible. But you understand, because that's probably why you set up Newton's tree.
Yeah.
These things are like, letting toddlers out into the world. That you need to keep a really careful eye on them. For many reasons. Number one, as you said, no one's claiming they're 100% accurate. So we should be collecting as much data as we can to figure out when they are not accurate, and then feeding that back to the developers to try and improve them. And I've seen a lot of companies gain their initial regulatory clearance. They go on market, they've been on market for 3 or 4 years now, and then they fail their repeat audits because you go for audit, during the life cycle of your device,
Yeah.
and they fail the repeat audit because they've got very little, sometimes no, post-market data. They do not know how their device is performing on market. And we all know that when you put an AI algorithm in a different environment, it performs differently. We all know that, but we're
Yeah.
not measuring it. And so I don't think we can go to full automation until we have that infrastructure in place to be collecting all of that data about performance. And that's tricky because let's say you're finding something on a CT scan, like a pulmonary embolus.
Yeah.
Even in current practice, radiologists don't know if they were correct or not. You write the report and go, there's a PE. You never hear back. You don't know if it's correct.
Yes.
How's the AI going to know? It's not. We need to build that infrastructure in so that can be fed back to the developers to go, you were correct, you were incorrect. And that's
Yeah.
currently not happening. And I don't see we can get to full autonomy without that kind of framework in place.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the really frustrating things being a sort of a researcher in this space is that a lot of the things that you need to do, for example, measuring baseline, continuous monitoring, long-term follow-up, is actually not an AI specific thing. It's something we should be doing in medicine in general, right? And it's often people who start their clinical research career in AI realize like, oh, wait a minute, I'm doing much more than AI work. I'm actually doing sort of bread and butter clinical research and data collection, which is, and then often people are like, I didn't get into this for this, right? I was just wanted to do the AI bit, but actually it's a lot of stuff around AI that you need to be measuring.
But
Um,
that's actually that's
yeah,
the meat of it. Develop. I always say to our clients who've got an AI system, building the AI is like 5% of your journey here.
yeah,
It's that it's actually not to belittle AI machine learning specialists. It's probably the easiest part.
yeah.
You get the data, you build your model, you retrain, you fine tune until you're happy with the results. Plugging it into a system, making sure it's cyber secure, complies with all the regulations, and then collecting all that post-market data. These are systemic problems that we haven't even fully solved yet.
Yeah. Can I move on to financial incentives and the money and how these things get funded? And obviously, we're going to declare a sort of an interest here in that Newton's Tree is a VC funded business. But also, what's important to add, and I hope this doesn't bias your answer, is a lot of the work that we do at Newton's Tree has been developed and built over 7, 8 years, and sort of incubated inside the NHS, whether that's just the thinking or even hard technology. And so it's not been a traditional VC journey where you start with a PowerPoint presentation deck and sell a lot of dreams. Um, and it reminds me of a quote that I'm going to butcher from Charlie Munger, which says that he said something like, "If you show me the incentives, I'll tell you the outcome," or something like that. The VC business, which you'll be familiar with, is predicated on sort of hyper growth, right? These funds raise money from their limited partners like pension funds, universities, other places, and they expect to return many multiples of their fund in a very short period, 5 to 10 year period. Healthcare is an industry that's dominated by players that are 50, 100 years old, right? In some instances. Um, Opening question: is venture capital a force for good in healthcare innovation?
The way I see VC is they're essentially gambling on researchers getting lucky. And yes, they want multiple
But is it
returns.
is it helpful to their healthcare system?
Well, I'll get to that. So
Okay.
the VCs want returns, multiple returns, bigger than if they just put it into a cash cash account.
Cash ISA. Yeah.
They want 10x or something like that. But they don't want it on all of their investments. They are really happy to lose on 90% of their investments. And I think a lot of the VC funded startups forget that they are a gamble via VC. And just because you've raised 5, 10, whatever million, the VC is entirely prepared to lose that entire thing and just say goodbye to you and never speak to you again. Because you tried, but you weren't the one. And so there's this kind of expectation amongst all the startups that they're 100% going to succeed. And they have to believe that. Otherwise, they get into this cognitive dissonance state of actually, we're just an experiment. And so it kind of detracts from that scientific principle I said earlier about having a null hypothesis. The null hypothesis of the VC is that 90% will fail. And so to your point on, is it a force for good? I think it's great because it's advanced research massively. The downside is that it's created this absolute monstrous wave of hype, which has hyper-focused the research into very specific areas. I see very little groundbreaking research being done. It's all kind of copycat. It's like someone invented transformer networks and now the whole world has gone insane. It's kind of like, well, we need someone else to reinvent transformers and come up with the next architecture that's actually going to make a difference. And I feel like VC funding kind of detracts from that groundbreaking research. Because sometimes, and in fact, many of the cases, if you look at humanity's history, the groundbreaking research wasn't for a commercial VC funded thing. It was very basic scientific knowledge, which leads to other people building off. And I think that's what companies like OpenAI are trying to do, is they're not trying to necessarily commercialize the product per se on its own. They want to build a technology that everyone else builds off. Hence the valuation, which is probably slightly overvalued. So yeah, I think it's a force for good in terms of encouraging this experimental research, but a negative force in terms of overinflating expectations of everybody.
Then what would be an alternative model, right?
If I knew that, I'd be a very rich man. So I have no idea.
I think one of the things, particularly with data-driven technologies, aside from the funding challenge, but closely related to it, is that there is a lot of risk in the technology until that doesn't get de-risked until you plug it into a live system, right? And so it's the same thing even if you're an academic. Like the days of being able to publish, here's a convolutional neural network I've trained on this retrospective data set, that being interesting has long gone, right? Because people realize that actually doesn't really mean much. It's all about implementation, outcomes, and impact, right? And similarly, from a technology perspective, you've not really de-risked the business until it's been used in anger in a hospital that wasn't involved in developing the technology. And so, should some of the resources, whether it's directly from venture capital, from governments, and from other areas, be funding the healthcare system's participation in helping de-risk some of these technologies?
No, absolutely. I'll give you a really concrete example. So going back to the AI for breast cancer screening, this technology, there are somewhere between 12 and 20 companies with regulatory cleared products that can do breast cancer screening using AI.
Yeah.
However, the UK's Breast Cancer Screening Committee, which is the final barrier to actually, someone deploying this stuff in the UK, have to date been reluctant to accept the evidence that's been presented to them that this stuff is safe and effective. And they're currently setting up a trial, which I believe, like, happy to be corrected, is supposed to take 6 years of prospective evidence. That is just not feasible for startups to fund. A 6-year-long trial. A big pharma company would still balk at a 6-year-long trial for a new drug, let alone a small AI startup. So absolutely, I think we need to think about centralized funding for that kind of work. And we need to look back to the big pharma model of the 4 main stages of clinical trials. In essence, what you're talking about there is a stage 4 study, a real world prospective stage 4 study. Now, who funds that in pharma? It's the big pharma companies because they've got billions. but no one's got billions in the AI market. Well, not in health tech anyway. They do
Yeah.
in general AI, obviously. But they need to be fun. They need to be thinking at that scale. And it's my belief that just like 100 years ago, we used to have snowball salesmen and apothecaries selling you lotions and potions, and we've
Yeah.
now evolved into this heavily regulated, massive money-making machine that is big pharma with 4 or 5 pharma companies with a monopoly of the whole system. I think the same will happen with health technology because the budgets needed to get there are going to be as great, if not an order of magnitude greater.
Yes, I think that's one of the things that I've heard you saying publicly about AI being like drugs or the new drug. And I want to pivot slightly more to your public voice.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, a big sort of proponent and champion of innovators investing early and properly in regulatory preparedness and their market access. Also on sort of more cutting edge topics around ambient scribes, whether they're medical devices, when they're summarizing things, or whether or not, this whole gray zone. Um, do you recognize yourself as a system leader? I think that's an awkward question probably to ask
I,
you, but you are, and do you is that a conscious thing that you think about?
no, look, I never set out to be considered a leader, and I'm slightly uncomfortable with like being called that. I don't know. Listen, I'm half Belgian, and I don't, if you know anything about Belgian people, they're just incredibly blunt and upfront. And all I do is I'm just incredibly blunt and upfront, and I just try and highlight to people, that there are laws and there are regulations in place, and maybe that people should consider abiding by them. And I have very little ego in that. I'm just doing it because I think it's the right thing to do. Um, And so, yeah, I've been nicknamed the LinkedIn regulatory police because I'm basically calling out all these hype. It used to be the Twitter police, but I've kind of stopped using Twitter since Elon Musk
I
took
think
over.
we all have. Yeah, yeah.
So I moved to LinkedIn really. But I don't do it for fun. I don't do it to be mean. I do it because for me, because I know this stuff so deeply and in detail, it's almost mind-boggling to me that the rest of the world hasn't caught on that these things exist, these laws, these regulations exist. And that, as my background as a doctor, my fundamental principle is we should not be doing any harm.
Yeah,
And that's what I'm trying to avoid happening. Um, if we go to the example of large language models as scribes,
yeah,
look, I'm incredibly excited about that kind of technology. I'm
yeah,
just not convinced that it's entirely as safe and effective as everyone kind of thinks it is. The clinical record is an incredibly powerful yet delicate thing. Incorrect information in a record can kill people. I'm not saying it will for sure, but it can. And that's a risk that has to be quantified, measured, and mitigated against.
yeah,
It's also incredibly difficult to remove incorrect information from a clinical record. Very, very hard to do. And I just think the fact that we know that large language models hallucinate, we know that they can fabricate, we know that they can omit, and of course they can misunderstand and actually get context wrong. These are all factors that almost seem to get forgotten when people are using these systems. And I get it. They can appear really fluent and really plausible completely, but that makes them even more dangerous because it's not like, you do a calculation on a simple calculator and you get a funny number and you think, oh, that number's funny. This large
yeah,
language model is explicitly designed to try and make you believe that it's giving you the correct answer.
yeah,
And we don't know fully exactly how they work. And I believe, look, our team, we did an extensive piece of research looking at the applicable laws in Europe on medical devices. And we believe that they should be classified as medical devices based on three principles, which are in the law. Like we didn't make these up. First of
yeah,
all, are they being used for a clinical purpose? Now, some people will say, well, it's just dictation software. You could use that for anything. I'm like, yeah, but you're literally claiming people can use this for their clinical note taking or summarizing clinical things. Like you've said it's clinical, not us. So therefore, you're kind of edging into a clinical purpose.
Mm.
Secondly, people like non-qualified people are not allowed to make entries into the clinical record, right? If you had someone off the street come in and start to edit their record, you'd be like, no.
Yeah.
It's part of what a regulated human person does. And if a human person started making things up or getting things wrong consistently, they would be disciplined or fired or retrained. So it's kind of like, well, it's doing something clinical, it's doing something that a regulated professional will do. And then you actually look at the nuances of what the regulations say about what types of software should be regulated. And it explicitly says if you are doing anything more than simple search or recall, or a simple calculation that can be easily verified, or lossy compression, then you are a medical device. And LLMs are obviously doing more than simple search or lookup, and they're doing what I call lossy compression, which is
Yeah.
where you compress information,
Yeah.
summarize it irretrievably back to the long form. So once you've got the LLM summary, you can't turn that summary back into the entirety of what was said in the clinical consultation. It's being compressed. And on top of that, the summarizers aren't just summarizing. What they're doing is they're taking in an entire transcript and they are deciding what to include and what to omit. There's a decision being made. I mean, I'm ascribing a human task to a computer, but you know what I mean? The computer
Yeah. Yeah.
is saying, look, that bit wasn't important, this bit was. And who's to say that the computer's getting that right? And I'm really happy for people to continue with this technology. I think it's going to be massively beneficial, but I do think we need to see the evidence here. And I do
Yes.
think they need to be doing this abiding by the existing laws and regulations. Now, this is my opinion, or it's my team's opinion as well. Currently, to our knowledge, not a single large language model has been regulatory approved anywhere in the world. In fact, I saw a paper just this morning from the FDA confirming that, right?
Yeah.
So no one has got regulatory clearance. So what does that mean? It means that anyone using that technology in a clinical setting is using it as entirely their own risk.
Yeah.
They
Well, this is
cannot.
what I want to get onto. Sorry, Hugh. I just noticed what one is the time,
Mhm.
but I also noticed that there's lots of NHS staff listening in, and the Q&A is open. And so in the last few minutes, I'm happy to take a few questions.
Let's do some questions. Yeah.
The one thing that I get a lot, and I'm sure you do informally as well, is NHS staff get put in sometimes very awkward positions, right? Where you have a company who's saying that they're not a medical device. And then you have people like me and you who say, oh, we think maybe the company's wrong here. And the person in the trust is not an expert, right, by their own admission.
Yeah.
Um, how do they navigate those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, it's really, really tricky. It has to be done on a case-by-case basis. And I would urge trusts to train staff or bring in expertise if they're not sure. And ultimately, in the UK, you can write to the MHRA and ask. If they are a medical device, they should be registered on the MHRA database, and you should be able to look that up and check. If they say they're a medical device and they're not on the MHRA database, they are illegally on market because they haven't registered. So that's the first thing. If they say they're not a medical device, but others are saying they probably are, then you need to seek an expert opinion. And the ground truth would be the MHRA themselves. Sometimes, and we've done this for our clients, they want proof for their clients that they aren't a medical device. So we say, let's write a letter to the MHRA. You can show that letter to your clients to say, here's a letter from the MHRA saying you're not a medical device. And that's the correct way to do it, because then you avoid any he said, she said kind of nonsense. If they're not a medical device, well, if they think they're not a medical device and they are, then unfortunately they are in the first stage of regulatory grief, which is denial. And they will have a rude awakening because they may continue doing what they're doing, and one day they will get a letter asking them to take their device off market.
And well, one is, have you come across companies that have had that happen to them?
No, there was a period about a year and a half ago as we were transitioning to the MDR
Yeah.
where like 60–70% of our clients were people who had letters from not just the MHRA, from competent authorities in Europe and America saying, we believe you're not compliant and they would write to us and say, what do we do? And try and get them out of the mess. We couldn't get them all out of the mess because some were so far gone that it was impossible. Others managed to get them compliant.
Fine. No, that makes a lot of sense. I've just got a question come through from Jagdeep, who says that we'll soon see EPR releasing generally available software, including LLMs. We've seen this already happen through partnership with Epic and Abridge and things like that. Initial feedback from clinicians has been very positive. And in fact, I've heard of this as well in sort of pilots that have been done. People seem to love it. Um, the question is, do the benefits outweigh any risks?
Well, that's what the regulators ask you to prove.
Yeah.
In order to get regulatory clearance, you don't have to show that your device is perfect. You have to show the benefits outweigh the risks. And how do you do that? You measure the benefits and the risks. And you show empirically that there's a positive benefit risk ratio. And look, everything we do in medicine has risks. If you take someone's blood, if you do an operation, if you give them a drug, there's risks. It's the same with AI. I'm very happy for there to be risks. What I'm
Yeah.
not happy for is for people to sell stuff without having measured the risks and try to mitigate against them, or be honest with their clients about what those risks are and try to bury them under the carpet.
But I guess what Jagdeep's question is driving at is that a lot of those, and we know that EPR vendors are famous for this, is baking in features or models or whatever, which are medical devices, but haven't
Yeah, but they will
gone
only
through a
get in trouble
process.
with the regulatory authorities. Once people, so the MHRA typically tend to write for two reasons. Either someone makes a complaint about them, that might be a competitor or a user, or there's what's known as an adverse event. So a hospital raises an adverse event saying, we used this software and this patient came to harm. And you've got different types of adverse events, from non-serious to serious. And some are classed as never events, like you should never miss a stroke on a CT scan, for instance. And if the MHRA are aware of evidence of those things happening, or they receive a complaint, they will write to the company and say, we believe you're non-compliant if they haven't got medical device status. So the EPR vendors are running that gauntlet and that risk. And if I was their legal counsel, which I'm not, I'd be saying you need to seriously consider every functionality that you're planning on launching, whether it's a medical device or not, and you should make sure it's compliant in the relevant jurisdictions. Because otherwise, you are wide open to class action lawsuits.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hugh. We're running out of time rapidly. So I want to wrap up with a final question, um, which is what's exciting about the future of AI in healthcare? And whilst you think about that, I'm going to explain to the audience why I've been sort of looking down this whole time. We were supposed to do this in person, and Hugh was supposed to be sitting next to me in this with this lovely backdrop, but we had a bit of a snafu, which is why we've ended up in this sort of remote fashion. But hopefully next time we'll have a part two with Hugh sitting right next to me. But yeah, just on a final note, what's exciting you most about the future of AI in healthcare?
There's so much to be excited about. AI is this almost multi-purpose technology which can be applied to anything we put our imaginations to. I'm seeing it being used in virtual reality medical devices, to multimodal devices. And I think this like the sky is almost the limit about what humanity can achieve with AI. All I am doing is trying to make sure we do it safe and effectively, comply with existing laws. I'm also working with regulators on how we can possibly change these laws to try and make them a little easier to navigate, which I think needs to be done. I'm not saying the regulations are perfect, I never have, but they are there to tackle. So I can't give you a specific use case or a specific example, but there's just huge amounts of potential benefit. What I'm really waiting for is kind of what the next breakthrough in AI is going to be.
Yeah.
Had machine learning, we've had deep learning, we've had generative AI. What's next? What's it going to be? I don't know. Is it neurosymbolic AI? No one knows. When that breakthrough comes, there's going to be a whole new wave for VC funding and new medical devices coming to market, which are going to be even more complex than the ones we have now. And we're going to need to rethink the regulations again. And that's where I get really excited.
Fantastic. Perfect way to end this hour. Thanks so much, Hugh, again for your time and thanks everyone for listening in. I hope you've enjoyed our first conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone.